Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn Spotlight session, one in a series of sessions that explore various topics in the field of domestic, sexual and gender-based abuse. I'm Sharon Gaynor, Training and Research Assistant with Haven Horizons. Today I'm pleased to introduce my colleagues Madeline Mc Aleer, who is our Strategic Development Director, and Sarah Harte, Haven Horizons Planning and Communications Strategist, as well as a columnist for the Irish Examiner. Madeline and Sarah will talk about the 5 books that could save your life Shared Island project.
So Madeline, tell us briefly about the 5 books project. And
I've always been a reader, and so I passionately believe in the power of literature, the transformative power of literature. I find even in my own life that the right book at the right time changed my understanding of things. It changed my mindset. I think that books can just they can provide sort of like a whole new lens through which we can see the world differently. You know, we get other people's life stories right in our hand. And the project that we've called 5 Books That Could Save Your Life really came about because I was collecting and collating books on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, and people were always asking me for recommendations, and I gave Invisible Chains, the book by Dr. Lisa Arison-Fontes, to a woman who came into me. And when she came back with the book, she said, that book saved my life. And that was the spark, I suppose, that ignited the idea for the 5 Books That Could Save Your Life project.
Yeah, and then of course we developed it because we were lucky enough to get partners, 2 Northern Ireland partners, Reclaim the Agenda and Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid, and we got the Shared Island Civic Society funding. So far on that front, we've had 3 events, 1 in Ennis and 2 in Belfast, 1 in the Titanic Centre and 1 in the Seamus Heaney Centre. And we have an upcoming one, which we'll tell you about later, in Dublin, and then a webinar. So with regard to the 5 books, which are Invisible Chains, Remembered Forever, Brutally Honest, In Control, and What Is to Be Done About Violence Against Women, they're part of a larger collection that Haven Horizons donates every year has donated to Libraries Ireland and Libraries Northern Ireland. Why those 5 books out of the 75?
I think I was trying to select books that were accessible and that really highlighted the hidden tactics and dynamics of coercive control, really the red flags that we don't always see, and 2 memoirs that really talk about the personal experience of living with coercive control and its impact on individuals and on the family dynamic. And really, I wanted to sort of really highlight, how hidden the coercive control is and why it is so difficult to recognize, and the risks associated with coercive control because of the hidden nature of it. And I included the book What's to Be Done About Violence Against Women, because it's really looking at what are the solutions, how are we going to prevent and eliminate domestic, sexual and gender-based abuse globally.
Yeah, and having read the 5 books, I'd say that they're all pretty accessible as well. That's one of the things that stands out. I think anyone could access any of them. So tell us a little bit about, you mentioned there a minute ago, Invisible Chains. This is by Dr. Lisa Arison-Fontes. You gave it to a woman and she came back and said it changed her life. So tell us a little bit about that book. Why is that a book that is important, or what are the key messages?
Well, it's interesting that Dr. Lisa Arison-Fontes is a child psychologist. She's from the US, and she works in this area. And she herself, in her second marriage, ended up being trapped in a very coercively controlling relationship, and she didn't see it happening. And she found it very difficult to extract herself from that relationship. There was no overt physical violence, and she didn't recognize the tactics because it was the usual intermingled with, loving acts with, concern, feigned concern. And she talks about why so many different women are vulnerable, why young people are vulnerable. She talks about domestic, sexual, and gender-based abuse and coercive control in LGBT relationships with older people, people with disabilities, all that intersectional stuff that we would be talking about all the time. But one thing that she really highlights, and I think is really, really important, is why professional women are very susceptible to coercive control. And she expands on that, and then she gives checklists at the back, so people can go and tick some boxes and say, could this be coercive control? Because what happens is it's very confusing. The manipulation, the gaslighting really confuses people, and the victim is being blamed, and then they're trying to fix it. So I think those checklists really help people sort of self-identify, yeah, this is not okay.
And it's an interesting kind of, I think I particularly like that book because I think it's very interesting. I think she manages to highlight very well the subtlety of the process, and how I think that aspect of professional women getting entrapped is interesting because she herself was one, highly accomplished, and it's that notion that you don't see it happening. And I think another key thing that emerges from the book is, I think when people think of coercive control, or they think of domestic violence, they see it as not just a one-off event, but they see it as something that's very overt. And I think what Arantxa Infantes manages to highlight quite well is the fact that abuse is often interspersed with bouts of charm, and that makes it all the more confusing. So she's essentially saying anyone can be a victim, but there's particular types of victims. So there isn't really then, if I understand correctly, a typical profile of a victim. Not really.
No. Any age.
Any age. Well, how about, is there a typical profile of a perpetrator?
Well, I mean, I do deliver a whole lecture on this, but to just bring it down to the fact that what we all, the myth of the perpetrator, who you will recognize, the overtly violent, physically violent perpetrator is the myth, because that's what we see. But actually, the Australian research shows that 1/3 of men who murdered their partner or ex-partner had never been in contact with any services before, and that they were middle class and educated, and so were their partners. But the main thing was the coercive control and the pattern, the progressive pattern of controlling behavior. And this idea that it's put forward as a crime of passion, that someone's out of control, whereas in actual fact, it's often the need to have control over someone that is the driving force behind coercive control. And as we know, once there's a trigger that there's any sort of person trying to reduce that control or move away or separate, that's the most dangerous time, highest risk.
We might come back to that actually a little later. So just want to take you to the next book, Remembered Forever. So that's by the Harte brothers. What are the standout things in this book for you?
I think the line that always stands out is, why they wrote the book. They were so upset at the media coverage saying it was a crime of passion. And, and the second thing was that Luke said that they had never heard the words coercive control or seen the words coercive until they were sitting in the police station, and there was a poster on the wall. And they've had to reframe their whole childhood because of that. He would agree with Evan Stark's definition of coercive control, that it is domestic terrorism, in their case, family terrorism. It was hostage taking. They all had to live under their father's rule, and that was normalized, so they've had to reframe their whole childhood. And I think their book is very helpful for anybody who's looking at the family dynamics around coercive control, understanding it from the child's perspective.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well that the Harte brothers were effectively driven to become activists in the wake of their mother and sister's deaths because of the media coverage of Claire and Charlotte's deaths. But I mean, I think a lot of people in this virtual room today would, I'm not going to ask them now, but would probably agree with the notion that this way in which the media continue to frame not only coercive control, but domestic homicide is deeply problematic and adds to the problem of how we think, frame, and talk about domestic abuse and its causes. How about Brutally Honest? That's Mel B's. I see Danielle there in the virtual room, and that was her favorite
Yes.
book.
Yes.
What about Brutally Honest? What stands out for you about that?
Well, I remember the 80s and the girl power, and that this was a band that was putting forward, that young women can have
Was
what they
it
want
more
and
the
do what they
90s, I
want.
think, was it? Was it the
Okay, I
90s?
don't know because I didn't really follow them. Like I was born in the 60s, so
Okay.
around that time it's all the same to me. But I mean, so what we actually learn in retrospect is that here was this rich, famous pop star, but behind the scenes, behind the closed door, she lost complete control of every aspect of her life, and she was targeted at a very vulnerable time. So personally and professionally, everything she did was controlled. Her children, what she ate. He was, encouraging her to drink and use drugs, videoing her, telling her that she would lose custody of her children. He had total control of her bank account. I mean, it's really the image-based abuse, the technology-based abuse, the drugs and alcohol. It's a really
The
difficult read. It's, I mean, I recommend it to people because they can see the disparity between what was publicly and then they hear what was going on for those 10, 15 years behind the scenes. And that fear of losing her children and how she actually had to go back and live with him and clean up her act to prove, because otherwise he would have got custody of the children. So
it's
that's why I
it's
recommend that book to people.
it's
Yeah.
it's interesting, I think, the addiction aspect, because until last week, having read that book, I would concur with all the things you've said, but I didn't really think so much about the addiction aspect. And last week we had a really powerful presentation from Gillian Dennehy from SAIL, the Divinia project, which is online. I think Sharon can tell you about that later if anybody wants to go back and watch it. But it was kind of mind-blowing. She really brought home that very complex nexus between addiction and domestic abuse, and how, I suppose, addiction can be a response on the part of the victim to the situation they find themselves in, but how it can be also leveraged by the abuser,
Mhm.
both during the relationship, which is what happened to Mel B, being encouraged to use or to drink or whatever your addiction is, and then leveraged afterwards to construct the victim as unfit, be that as a mother or whatever. Um, so next book, In Control, which is a pretty famous book by Jane Monckton Smith, whom a lot of people will be familiar with. What there was the standout thing for you?
Well, I suppose the subtitle of the book says Dangerous Relationships and How They End in Murder.
Mm.
And she would now maybe add that how they end in murder or suicide. So it's really looking at the impact of the progressive nature of coercive control. And she's developed this 8-stage timeline, and the importance of understanding that timeline and developing an appropriate safety plan, and that risk assessment isn't static, it has to be dynamic, and the safety plan has to be dynamic, and you have to have multi agencies coming together to close those gaps that allow domestic homicide to happen, or that leave women feeling so vulnerable that they die by suicide as a result of seeing no way out. So, again, frontline professionals, if you haven't read this book, I think everybody needs to read it. Uh, I've attended Jane Monckton's training on a number of occasions. And on one occasion, a guard nearly ran out of the room. And when I was talking to him, he said, I have 4 or 5 women who are at stage 6 or 7 on this timeline, and I need to go and do something about it. So it's just so useful for frontline professionals.
And the other interesting thing as well, when I remember reading the 5 books, was that Jane Monckton Smith's own adult daughter was
Mhm.
involved in a very it was in a very abusive, coercively controlling relationship for certainly 2 years, if not more. And she's quite interesting on that, about what it's like to try
Mhm.
and intervene. So that might be helpful to someone as
Yeah.
well who's in a comparable situation. So the 5th book is the What Is to Be Done about violence against women. And that's kind of slightly different in that this is more solution focused rather than describing the process, how it occurs. And so what was the standout thing for you about that?
Well, it's really a retrospective book. It takes the same name as a book that was written in 1983 by Elizabeth Wilson called What's to be Done About Bias. And they look at what has been done and why have we still the same levels, and what do we need to do differently. And the review of those 40 years, I think it sort of informs the work I do, because the work I do is all about prevention. How do we prevent this from happening in the first place? And I suppose it's focusing on intervention, the services that victims need, the symptoms, the obvious problems, and then focusing on criminalization and all the gaps in the criminalization. But really, if you do that, you're never going to you're never going to prevent domestic, sexual, and gender-based abuse, because you can't police and criminalize your way out of what's a social and cultural problem. That's what Professor Kate Fitzgibbons in the book says. She speaks at Davos and the World Economic Forum, and we've got to turn to looking at the attitudes, the beliefs, the systems and the structures in society. And that's where our work is focused now.
Yeah, and hopefully that's a message that society generally, that we're all beginning to wake up to. Okay, well, we have, just to recap there for a second, we have two events. So Haven Horizons, Reclaim the Agenda, Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid. We will be appearing at the atrium of the Department of Justice on the 16th of October. And then on the 20th of November, we're going to have a webinar with the 4 of the 5 authors that we've just mentioned. We won't be having Mel B, just to let you know, because I think some people thought that might be the case, but all the other experts we will have. So Sharon, over to you now.
Thanks so much, Sarah and Madeline, for that very informative talk. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so this week's Lunch and Learn recording, including Gillian Dennehy, as Sarah mentioned earlier, they'll be available on our YouTube channel and in the Lunch and Learn section of our virtual community of practice, where you can comment on the sessions and share your thoughts.